Today, we will be continuing on with our dress shirt. We're going to continue preparing our sleeve to go on to our shirt. So we're going to do our underarm seam and then put our cuff on the sleeve. And then we'll put our collar on the shirt, which we prepared last week. So let's go ahead and switch over and we'll get started. Okay, so I've got my two sleeves over here that I did my placket on, and we basted over our pleats last week. So this week we're going to stitch that underarm seam that goes down the side, and then we'll also put on our cuff. So let's stitch this seam first. We're going to fold our sleeve in half, right sides together, match up those corners first. And then we can pin in between, just matching up the raw edges. I'm going to do that for both sleeves. Okay, let's go stitch both of these at 1/2 inch. So I'm just going to start at one corner and work my way to the other at that 1/2 inch mark, making sure that I keep my edges even over here. Okay, and then same thing for my other sleeve. Okay, let's take these over to our ironing board and press them. I'm going to trim up my threads first. And then we're going to bust open these seams. So again, you can do that flat on the table, just like this. Or if you have a roll, you can stick that into the arm. And this roll just helps you prevent from getting creases on other areas of your sleeve. So we're going to bust it open first. And then we're going to press both of them to the back so we can do that welt seam. So my double notch is right here. So I know that's the back. So I'm going to press both over to that side. Okay, let's do the same for the other sleeve. Okay, and then again, we're going to press it to the back. So I'm looking for that double notch and I'll press it over to that side. Okay, please make sure you're on mute if you don't have a question. Okay, so now we've pressed both sleeve seams and we need to go to the right hand side of our fabric and we're going to do that 1/4 inch stitch to secure down those 2 seam allowances. So let's take this over to our machine and we'll do that. Okay, so I've got one sleeve and instead of turning this right side out, I'm actually just going to leave it inside out, but I'm working. You can see my full sleeve is inside out, but I'm working from that seam down. And the reason for that is as we do this sleeve, since it's a tube, in order to sew that entire seam, it's going to kind of scrunch up around our foot. So you'll see as I go, I'm going to use my original seam as my guideline, put that at the 1/4 inch. My seam allowances are over here to the left where my needle's at. So let's stitch that at a 1/4 inch. So get over this initial little hump where the bulk is. There we go. And so I'll just keep pulling this sleeve back as we go and keeping that area right in front of my foot flat. Okay, so you can see how it's scrunched up around my foot as I was stitching. Okay, same thing for my other sleeve. For this one, I'm going to start from the hem and work my way up. And again, that's just so that I can have that seam over on the right-hand side. So you can start from the armhole, work your way down, or from the sleeve hem and work your way up. Either is fine. head over to our ironing board again.
Okay, now I'm going to trim up those threads from the stitch lines that I just did. We're going to turn this right side out. We have our little sleeve ready for our cuff to go on. Okay, so you should have, it's a little wrinkly, so I'll give it another press before we actually put the cuff on. But I should have my little pleats already basted with my placket opening, ready to get that cuff put on. So let's go ahead and grab our cuff. We're going to prepare that to go onto our sleeve. So you should have two cuffs. These rectangles are the exact same left and right. So I'm just going to fold it in half and pin that short side so we can stitch the short side first to close it up. And we have a notch there that shows us our stitch length or our stitch width, seam allowance width is going to be a 1/4 inch. So let's do that for both. Okay, let's stitch both of those at a 1/4 inch.
So now we're just going to stitch up each of those short sides at a 1/4 inch. I'm stuck at that little bulky part. There we go. Okay, let's get that back to our ironing board again.
So trim up those threads that you have hanging off. Okay. Now we need to trim and miter our trim our seam allowances and miter our corners. Like I said, these two cuffs are the exact same of each other. They're just a basic rectangle. So we're going to just pick one to be left and pick one to be right. But if our cuff had an extension on it or anything like that, we would need to be more careful about which one was left and right. Okay, so miter that top seam allowance, or sorry, trim the top seam allowance, then miter your corners. We're going to do the same for both ends. And then same on this one too. And that side with the shorter seam allowance is going to be the front of our cuff. Okay, now flip it right side out. We're going to use our point turner to form those 90-degree angle corners. And then from the front, so again, look at which side has that shorter seam allowance. That's the side that is the front. So from the front, you need to get those seams all the way out to the folded edge. And we're going to press this. And we want to make sure that from the front side of the cuff, none of the back side is sticking out at the edges. So make sure as you press those edges that you aren't able to see any of the back sticking out. And then we're just going to press a crease into the full length of the cuff. Again, on this side, make sure that that seam comes all the way out to the edge and that the back is not visible. Let's do the same with our second one. And then again, look and see which side has the short seam allowances. That will be your front. Okay, now we're ready to put this on our sleeve. I'm just going to do one today to save time in class. So let me go ahead and grab one of my sleeves and one of my cuffs. Again, make sure that that pleat and placket area is pressed really well before you go to put on your cuff, because that will permanently stitch down those pleats. So we need to make sure that they're folded and pressed nicely. Okay, we're going to attach this cuff just like we've done a waistband in the past, where we sew the front and the back separately, and the back will get attached with a stitch in the ditch. So I'm going to separate those two layers. I'm going to figure out again which one's my front. Put that right sides together with the bottom of my sleeve. And where that pocket opening is where the edges of the cuff are going to meet. So on the side where your bias strip has been folded back and basted, I want your cuff edge to come flush with that fold. I'm going to fold back the outside of the, or sorry, the back of the cuff. So I'm just stitching on that front. Let's pin that. And then I'm going to get my other end around here to the side where the bias strip is sticking off. And it's going to get, again, come all the way flush to the edge. Okay, now I can come in between and pin. And if we've folded our pleats properly and we've taken them up the correct amount, we didn't fold too much or too little, then this cuff should meet the length of our sleeve perfectly. There shouldn't be any extra ease. Okay, so there it is pinned. Now I'm going to go stitch that together at 1/2 inch. So this one, instead of 1/4, we're doing at 1/2. So I'm just going to start
at one end. I'm going to open up that cuff all the way so that I can get all the way back into that seam. I'm going to put my needle down first, right at that seam line of the cuff. And then we're just going to stitch around the sleeve at 1/2 inch. Again, always making sure to keep your raw edges even. Your underarm seam, so this is my underarm seam, and my pleats should stay folded over to the correct side because we have basted or top stitched them down, but always just double check to make sure that nothing is folding over in a direction that it shouldn't be. And again, we're going to stitch all the way over to that cuff seam on the other side. Just double check on your sleeve side, again, that those pleats stay folded over to where they were supposed to, and that you didn't get any tucks in your seam as you went.
Okay, now we're ready to trim our seam allowances. So the cuff seam allowance is going to go down to 1/8 of an inch. So starting right here at the edge, I'm going to cut that down to 1/8. Be careful not to trim off too much because we still want enough of a seam allowance left that our fabric won't fray and the stitches won't come undone. If your fabric starts to fray too much, then your stitches will have nothing to hang on to. Okay, and then the sleeve seam is going to go down to 1/4. So we're staggering the lengths of those seam allowances so that all the bulk doesn't hit at the same spot. Okay, now we can press both of these seam allowances up into the cuff. So I'm going to let my cuff stick off the end of my sleeve. And I'm going to put this on my ham just because it makes those seam allowances kind of pop out. And it's a little easier to press that way. So now we're going to press these seam allowances up into the cuff. So you can do this flat on your table. I just find it a little bit easier because they pop up whenever you put them on a curve. Okay, check that seam from the outside. So take a look at it from the outside and make sure that it's really nice and flat and that you don't have your cuff kind of rolling over towards your sleeve. Once you've got that done, we're ready to fix the back. So I'm going to turn this upside down so I can look at the bottom of my cuff. My seam allowances should be sticking down into my cuff. And so now I'm going to make sure that my cuff is laying completely flat. So I usually go from this bottom creased edge and smooth it up so that I know it's completely flat before I turn under my seam allowances. And the reason for that is that if I just start turning under seam allowances and pulling on this back, then what it can do is it can change the creased edge. It pulls up that back and it creates this like bubble on your cuff. So make sure that you have that cuff completely flat before you start to fold under your seam allowances. And we're just folding them under enough to cover up that stitch line so we can stitch in the ditch. Okay, and I'm going to press that. Still folding and pressing. I just wanted y'all to get a little bit better view. So again, from this crease up, I smooth it and then fold under my seam allowances here. Okay. Once you have that fully pressed, we're going to go from the outside and pin it. So pin goes right in the ditch line. Make sure that it's catching your not waistband, cuff on the back. And then you can finish pinning through. Again, make sure that both layers of your collar are staying completely flat to each other as you pin. You don't want to pull one more than the other so that they bubble. Okay, let's go stitch in the ditch to secure that back side. Okay, so I'm just going to start on one side, put my needle right down in that ditch line, and then we'll get started stitching. Again, it may be bulky right at the beginning, so you may have to help it to get started. Let's see. There we go. And then as I stitch, again, make sure my collar is completely flat. The front and back are laying flat to each other. Double check on the back that your cuff fully got caught,
And if you have any areas where your stitching did not catch the back and there's a hole, then you need to seam rip, repress, because most likely you turned under too much of your seam allowance, and then redo your stitch in the ditch. Okay, the next thing we're going to do while we're here is we're going to do a top stitch. Just like we did for the collar, we're going to do a 1/4 inch top stitch around the edge so that we keep that consistent aesthetic. And that's a commonly done thing for dress shirts. So I'm going to start up here at this corner. If you need to mark with the ruler where that 1/4 inch in is so that you can see exactly where the corner is to start, I would definitely suggest marking that somehow. So right at that, so I'm a 1/4 inch down from this edge and a 1/4 inch in from the short edge. Okay, so there is my top stitch going all the way around. See if I can get you a better view. There you go. You might be able to see it in that light right there. So that will go all the way around the 4 edges of your cuff. Okay, let's head back to our ironing board.
Okay, so clean up your cuff area, and then we're going to set that aside. We will put on our sleeves next time, but this time we are going to put on our collar. So I've got my cuff fully on there. Again, both of those edges of the cuff should come flush with where that opening is, and then eventually one will overlap the other to create that pleat look up at the placket, and then we'll have our button and buttonhole down here where they secure. So let's set that aside and let's grab our collar and our shirt. Okay, so our collar, we left those open ends when we did our top stitch. We left that open bit so that we could still separate the front and back of our collar. So we're going to put this on very similar to how we did the cuff. We're going to stitch on the under collar first, and then to secure the top collar, we will turn it under and stitch in the ditch. So let's do our under collar first. So that's the one, excuse me, without any interfacing, and it has that double notch. I'm going to start at my placket opening, and the edge of my collar should come flush to the edge of that placket opening. So I'm going to line those up. Make sure I get that top collar layer out of the way so that I'm only stitching that under collar layer. And then I'm going to work my way around and pin those reference points. So right at the shoulder, I'll have a single notch on my collar that matches up with the seam line of my shoulder, not the top stitching, the seam line. Oops, that came unpinned. There we go. Okay, double notch will meet together at center back. another single notch at the other shoulder line. And then the other side of our collar should come all the way to the edge of the popover placket. Okay, now we're going to go back in between and we're going to pin the rest of our neckline together. And again, if we've stitched everything at the proper seam allowance and we put in that stay stitching on our neckline at the very beginning to keep it from stretching out. So as long as your neckline hasn't stretched out and you've stitched everything at the proper seam allowance, these should be matching up perfectly. We shouldn't have any extra ease. Okay, we're going to go stitch these together at a 1/4 inch. Okay, so I'm just going to start at one side of my collar. And just like we did with the cuff, we want to get all the way back into that seam line. So unfold it and put your needle down right at that 1/4 inch at the seam line of that collar. And we're just going to stitch at a 1/4 inch all the way around. Your neckline is curved in comparison to the collar, which is straight. So if there's any point where you need to bend it up to help take up that curve, that's fine. It technically should not have ease, but just because you're trying to get a curve to meet with a straight line, it may try and resist on you. And it's very important as you do this one, because we have such a small seam allowance width, is that you check your raw edges and make sure that they're staying even the whole time. It's very easy for that one that's underneath to slip away, and then it doesn't get caught enough and it frays, and then eventually your stitches come out because it doesn't have enough seam allowance to hold on to. You can see how much I'm checking and adjusting to make sure that those raw edges stay even.
Okay, let's take this back to our ironing board again.
Okay, let's trim up our threads that are sticking off. And then we need to trim and clip our seam allowances because this one is a curved neckline seam. So our, excuse me, let's do this the other way. There we go. So our neckline is going to be the one that's longer. So we're going to trim our collar seam allowance in half. Okay. Okay, now we're going to press those seam allowances up into the collar. So again, I like to do this part on my ham just because it makes it a little bit easier to get into that seam allowance area. But we're going to put that there and press those seam allowances up into that collar area. Make sure that those are separated. Those layers, the collar and shirt layers, are separated as much as possible as you press. Oh, we forgot to clip. I'm going to go back and clip. So on this curve here, we need to clip through both seam allowances. It's not a very steep curve, so we can do it every maybe 3/4 of an inch to an inch. Okay, and again, I'm going to check that press on the other side of the fabric before I move on. Make sure that it's really pressed well and that it's nice and flat before I move on to the next step. Okay, the next step is to fold that back or that inside of your collar. So I'm going to lay this nice and flat on my table. And I'm going to start tucking under. Again, make sure that your collar is really nice and flat so that you're not pulling one side more than the other. And then you're just going to smoothly tuck under that seam allowance, covering up your previous stitch line. We're going to press and we'll pin from the other side in a minute. little frayed edges from my fabric raveling. So just trim those up and clean up as I go. Okay, now from the other side, I'm going to pin. Again, pin goes right into the stitch or the seam line, making sure that it's catching on the other side. This is part of why it's so important when you do that initial press of this seam, the first seam that you stitch where it's right sides together, that you press it really nice and flat, because you're now using that seam as a guide. And if you haven't pressed it flat, then you don't have an accurate point to use as a reference. Looks like some of my seam allowances are coming undone. Just retuck them. Okay, so let's go stitch in the ditch and secure the back side of that collar.
So again, as usual, I start with my needle right in that stitch line. So getting stuck at that at that bulky part, sorry. So again, as I'm stitching, make sure my collar over on this side stays completely flat so I don't end up with any bubbles. And then I use my finger over on this side to feel for that thickness underneath where the seam allowance was turned under. So I can make sure that I'm catching it.
Okay, again, check on the inside. Make sure that your collar was fully caught and that you don't have any areas where it comes undone or open. Okay, let's go clean this up, and then that's where we're stopping for today. Okay, so here's our shirt with our collar attached to the top. I'm just going to clean up my little thread tails. And then to fold this later on, what we're going to do is we need a neck shape in there. And then we're going to fold right on this corner where the little curved extension starts. We're going to fold right on that corner all the way around. So I'm folding down the back. And then that top popover placket will overlap the bottom one. And right where that collar folded, it should meet right here at the top at center front, and then it'll split into the separate points. Okay, so that's how it should be coming together. So we're going to stop there for today. Next time we'll start putting on our sleeves and start talking about the finishing aspects of the hem and the button and buttonholes.